The traditional Korean Hanok we often imagine was not a house that appeared fully formed overnight. From the age when people sheltered in caves, through temporary huts, pit houses, underfloor heating systems, wooden floors, and timber structures, the basic form of the Hanok we know today gradually took shape by the Joseon dynasty. In this video, we will not look at Hanok simply as beautiful old houses. Instead, we will follow its development step by step and ask why the roofs became so broad, why the floors were warm, and why wooden halls and courtyards became such important parts of the home.
One of the most distinctive features of Hanok is that ondol and maru exist together within the same house. Ondol was a system designed for cold winters. It stored the heat from fire beneath the floor, warming the surface where people sat and slept. Maru, on the other hand, was designed for hot summers. By raising the floor above the ground, it avoided moisture and allowed wind to pass underneath, creating a cool and airy space. In other words, Hanok was a house whose center of life changed with the seasons. In winter, people lived mainly in the warm ondol rooms. In summer, they spent more time on the maru and in the open wooden hall. 5 major conditions shaped the form of Hanok. The first was climate. The Korean peninsula has cold winters and hot, humid summers. The second was terrain. With many mountains and limited flat land, houses had to be planned carefully according to the direction of the land and the flow of wind. The third was materials. Because wood, earth, stone, and paper were the main materials, elements such as columns, beams, roof eaves, and stone foundations became especially important. The fourth was lifestyle. People needed spaces for farming, storing grain, receiving guests, and holding ancestral rituals. The fifth was social order. During the Joseon dynasty, family structure, social status, gender roles, and ritual practices were all reflected in the layout of the house. For people of the Paleolithic age, a house was not yet a completed architectural structure. The most important thing was finding a safe place to protect the body from rain, wind, cold, and wild animals. So people used natural caves and rock shelters. When needed, they also built temporary huts using wood, grass, and animal hides. These early huts were not directly the same as Hanok, but they left behind an important principle. That principle was to create a frame, cover it with a protective layer, and form an interior space. The timber structure and roof of Hanok ultimately begin from this ancient question: how can humans protect themselves from the outside environment? By the Neolithic age, people began staying in one place for longer periods. As farming began and settled life became more important, pit houses appeared. These houses were built by digging into the ground. This helped reduce wind exposure and made use of the Earth's relatively stable temperature. Now people were no longer simply using natural caves. They were beginning to create interior spaces with their own hands. Inside the house, there was a hearth. The hearth was used for cooking food, producing light, and reducing the cold. It was not yet ondol, but the tradition of fire becoming the center of domestic life began here. During the Bronze Age, houses became longer and wider. Homes that had once been closer to a circular shape gradually changed into rectangular structures. This was a very important change. Families became larger, farming tools and grain needed to be stored, and sleeping spaces and working spaces needed to be separated. Clear post holes also began to appear. Columns supported the roof more securely and helped divide the interior space in a more organized way. The later Hanok concept of khan, or structural bays, and the logic of timber frame construction developed upon these earlier changes. One of the most important changes in the history of Hanok was the way people controlled fire. At first, fire was made in a central hearth inside the house, but smoke and ash created serious problems. Over time, the fire moved toward the wall, or kitchen area, and the kitchen hearth began to develop. Then came gudol, a system that allowed the heat and smoke from fire to pass beneath the floor. The key idea of gudol was not to let heat disappear into the air. Instead, heat was stored in a floor made of stone and earth. Because of this, even after the fire went out, the floor stayed warm for a long time. This was the beginning of Korea's floor-based lifestyle and the ondol room. Ondol was not a technology invented all at once in a single period. First, in the Neolithic Age, there was a central hearth. By the late Bronze Age, heating hearths and cooking hearths began to separate. From the Proto-Three Kingdoms period into the early Three Kingdoms period, primitive gudel appeared as kitchen-style hearths became connected to flues. Later, during the Three Kingdoms, Balhae, and Unified Shilla periods, partial gudel systems were used. These did not heat the entire room, but warmed only certain areas along the walls. From the Middle Koryo period into the early Joseon period, full-room ondol systems gradually spread. By the late Joseon period, along with colder climate conditions, ondol became widely used across the country and became a core structure of Hanok. The structure of Hanok is not based on walls supporting the building. Instead, it uses a timber frame system in which wooden columns, beams, purlins, and rafters share the weight. Because of this structure, the walls became relatively flexible. Large doors could be installed, windows and doors could be changed, and open spaces like the daechung, with almost no walls, could be created. Tile roofs were heavy, but they were excellent at shedding rain and snow, and they were highly durable. To support these heavy roofs safely, the structure of columns, beams, and rafters became increasingly refined. The beautiful roofline of Hanok is not simply decorative. It is the result of both structure and function. During the Goryeo period, ondol and maru became more closely combined. Ondol rooms preserved heat better when they were enclosed. So in winter, people developed a lifestyle of closing the doors and living inside warm rooms. Maru worked in the opposite way. It functioned best when it was open. By raising the floor above the ground, it avoided moisture and allowed wind to pass through, creating a cool space for summer. As these two completely different spaces came together in one house, Hanok became a home used differently according to the season. The winter room and the summer maru. This became one of the essential ways of life in Hanok. By the Joseon dynasty, Hanok came close to the form we are familiar with today. Ondol rooms, the daechung wooden hall, the kitchen, courtyard, anche, sarangche, haengnangche, ancestral shrine, walls, and inner gates were all combined within one organized system. What is important is that the completion of Joseon Hanok was not simply the result of architectural technology. Confucian family order, social hierarchy, ancestral rituals, and the way guests were received were all reflected in the structure of the house. The anche became the center of family life and household work. The sarangche became a space for receiving guests, studying, and social activity. The house was no longer just a shelter. It had become a space that contained the rules of society. Each part of Hanok was an answer to a real problem of daily life. For severe cold, people needed ondol, which stored the heat of fire beneath the floor. For heat and humidity, they needed maru, which raised the floor and allowed air to flow through. To protect wood and earth walls from rain and snow, large roofs and long eaves were necessary. To safely support heavy roofs, columns, beams, and purlins were needed. In other words, Hanok was not a house made for decoration. Its structure emerged as people solved the problems of cold, heat, rain, farming, family life, and receiving guests. Hanok did not have the exact same form everywhere in Korea. In the northern regions, winters were long and cold, so compact, double-layered house structures developed to improve heat retention. Windows were smaller, roofs were lower, and there was a stronger tendency to handle daily life and work indoors. In the southern regions, however, houses had to respond to hot and humid weather. As a result, single-layered houses with good ventilation and wide daechung wooden halls developed. But climate alone cannot fully explain these regional differences. Economic conditions, lifestyle, and social and cultural factors also played important roles.
Hanok was a regional answer created by both the natural environment and human life.
There are several common misunderstandings about Hanok. The first is the idea that the curved eaves are simply decorative. Of course, they are beautiful, but the basic function of the eaves was to direct rainwater away from the walls, block the strong summer sun, and allow the lower winter sunlight to enter. The second misunderstanding is that all Hanok were tile-roofed houses. In reality, tile-roofed houses were more common among the upper classes and in public architecture, while thatched-roofed houses were common among ordinary people. The third misunderstanding is that Hanok had one fixed standard form. In fact, Hanok varied greatly by region, social class, and historical period. Hanok was not a fixed shape. It was a house that changed according to its conditions. There are several common misunderstandings about Hanok. The first is the idea that the curved eaves are simply decorative. Of course, they are beautiful, but the basic function of the eaves was to direct rainwater away from the walls, block the strong summer sun, and allow the lower winter sunlight to enter. The second misunderstanding is that all Hanok were tile-roofed houses. In reality, tile-roofed houses were more common among the upper classes and in public architecture, while thatched-roofed houses were common among ordinary people. The third misunderstanding is that Hanok had one fixed standard form. In fact, Hanok varied greatly by region, social class, and historical period. Hanok was not a fixed shape. It was a house that changed according to its conditions.